tonight is Douglas Card, and he is an adjunct professor in his department of sociology, and he's been teaching for about 40 years, specializing in courses in social inequality. Yeah. Before we turn it over to him, I would like to remind you guys to turn off cell phones and pagers. And there's also a sign-up sheet going around. If you would provide us with your email address, we can enroll you in the Hamilton Think Tank Blackboard site. With that said, here is Douglas Card.
Thank you. See, my first order of business was going to be to thank all of you students for showing up. And let's see, for those of you, you're real students, you're not part of the program, right?
I'm part of the program.
Oh, you're part of the program, okay. You're a real student, okay, because frankly, this is such a significant and emotional hot topic. It would have been wonderful if there had been 50 people show up to think about this, because we have 4 excellent panelists from both sides. So thank you, those of you who didn't make it tonight, and we'll have a good discussion, even only among ourselves. Also, I was going to tell the audience that on the one hand, for something like this, I don't mind people showing their emotions a little bit, because I think it's kind of dull if everybody has to promise not to show if they agree or disagree. On the other hand, of course, we want to be sure that nobody is going to be making catcalls or personal attacks or harassing anybody on the panel. But looking at all of you, I don't think there's any problem with that at all. I want to mention that last spring, somehow I ended up as a moderator of one of these panels, and actually that particular panel was on the issue of abortion. And we had an excellent panel. We had 2 women who were pro-life and 2 women who were pro-choice. And they were all friendly, cooperative, and articulate. And I think we all felt we had a really wonderful 2-sided panel discussion. It was very informative. And one of the things I liked is that the panelists on that issue found that they had some things in common, which is important because so often we think, for example, pro-lifers and pro-choicers have nothing in common. Yet at the end of the panel, one could see that people on both sides were clearly opposed to casual random sex that ends up resulting in unwanted pregnancies, and that both sides were saying we all need to be more responsible in our behavior, because an unwanted pregnancy is going to be a problem no matter how we deal with it. So I'd like to think that this panel tonight is going to be as responsive and fair-minded and educational as that panel was last spring. My own feeling is, if the truth be told, if people are willing to really share their feelings, I think this is a much more controversial topic, frankly, than the issue of abortion. And for one thing, this is an issue that affects every single one of us in this room, whether we are a professor or we're a student. If you're a student, you're paying tuition money, or the idea that your parents think you're going off to get a good education and not be indoctrinated from any point of view. And if you're a professor, obviously, we profess what we think is the right thing to profess, and so therefore, to be told that we are biased in one direction or another would be a real problem for a professor. So that makes this, I think, a very emotional issue. It's one of the hottest topics in America today. We have a lot of conservative columnists these days who are writing opinion pieces denouncing universities as being too leftist. I myself was attacked by that well-known conservative organization Campus Watch and accused of being a leftist extremist, and I actually finally had to sue Campus Watch in order to clear my name. So I have a pretty good feeling for how controversial these issues can become. Now, is the question tonight, is the faculty liberal or is the faculty too liberal? And those are 2 very, very different questions. I just want to quote from a couple of things. I kept this from last spring. Study backs liberal faculty image. According to this national study, by their own description, 72% of those teaching at American universities and colleges are liberal, and only 15% say that they're conservative. That's 72% to 15%. It's not even close. And so clearly I want to say the issue is not, is the faculty liberal? And I don't think that we can argue with either one of you who want to make the claim that our faculty is liberal, because basically faculties across America are liberal. Some universities more, some are less. But the question is, does that automatically mean too liberal? And I think by too liberal, the question is, do we stray from the facts to try to push our own opinions on other people in order to indoctrinate them? Now, as I say, this is a very hot issue. If you looked at this morning's Eugene Register Guard, here's a column by John Tierney, who starts off that a while back he wrote about the leftward tilt on campus. And so he thinks all these liberals who sent me treatises explaining that the shortage of conservatives on faculties is not a result of bias, that these liberal professors gave me other theories such as conservatives do not value knowledge for its own sake, conservatives don't care about the social good, conservatives are too greedy to work for professors' wages, or somehow conservatives are just too dumb to get tenure. Well, needless to say, Mr. Tierney didn't agree with those points of view at all, and his rest of his column is on the fact that yes, professors are way too liberal, and therefore our student body is being indoctrinated. So again, on the question of are the majority of faculty liberal and perhaps Democrat, the answer is obviously yes, and there's no debate about that. Whether or not this is a problem, whether or not the faculty is too liberal, whatever that means, is the subject of tonight's debate. Now, fortunately, as always, our organizers managed to balance this panel with two people who will basically be taking the affirmative position that yes, faculty is too liberal, and we'll have two people taking a more the negative position that no, the faculty is not too liberal. And so starting on the left, if I may, make our introductions. Let me introduce everybody. And then what we're going to do is we want to be really strict about fairness. And so we are going to, on the opening presentation, each one of you will have 10 minutes. And the way we'll have a timer. And the way we will work it is simply this. We're going to have a flip of the coin, and whichever side wins can choose to have their team be first and third, or second and fourth. So you would either be first and third, or you'll be first and third, you'll be second and fourth. So first, let me just introduce all four of the people on the panel. First is, on the far left, is my friend Chuck Hunt, and I can confess I've known Chuck for years and years and years, and so Chuck, as a good liberal, I will bend over backwards to see that you don't talk too much. That's
I agree, except I would reject the term of liberal, but I'm very comfortable being here on the far left.
Okay, there you go. And thank you very much, because way too often we use the term liberal for people who most clearly are not liberal, who in fact have contempt for the very word liberal and don't want to be associated in any way or shape or form with the term liberal, even though that's the title of our panel tonight. Chuck and I actually ended up going through graduate school here the second time together, and I've known Chuck's courses a lot. Chuck is very well known on our campus. If you read the letter to the editor this morning in the Oregon Daily Emerald, we find Chuck being mentioned as he often is. And of course, some of you know, besides being a sociologist and an activist, Chuck is a beekeeper. He's a professional beekeeper, also a fisherman. So Chuck has a wide background. Now our second panelist is David Frank, and David Frank is probably well known to a lot of you. He is an associate professor of rhetoric and communication in the Robert D. Clark Honors College. He has published many, many, many books and articles, and one of his major areas of activism or activity is working on committees on international relations and the peace program, dealing with Palestinians and Israelis' narratives of peace and identity. David Frank. Then, I don't know much about you, Tyler.
I came on rather quickly.
Yes, and I want to thank you for that, Tyler,
No problem.
because actually this Mr. Warren, the person who has the letter to the editor this morning kind of critiquing Chuck, was the head of the College Republicans, had to cancel out because of a time conflict at the very last second. And so Kevin had to work very hard to quickly find somebody to balance the panel. And Tyler, thanks very much.
Yeah,
for
would you
showing.
like me to say a few words about myself?
Well, why don't you add
Oh,
on, because
okay.
I don't know much about you except that you're involved with the commentator.
Yeah, so last year, or for the past 2.5 years, I've been involved with the Oregon Commentator, which is a conservative libertarian journal on campus. Aside from that, I've been interviewed on radio programs. I've been involved in panels like this in the past. I don't know if I'll necessarily be or share the same views as Anthony Warren, who is the chairman of the College Republicans, but I think I'll try to bring a little bit more libertarian or I guess conservative point of view to this panel as well.
And that's great, because I look at the commentary from time to time, and sometimes there are articles critiquing the faculty as being a little bit too far to the left. So here's a
From time
case
to time.
where you can talk about this and get us into a dialogue. And our fourth speaker, Dr. Dennis Lindsay, we're very happy to have. He is visiting us from Northwest Christian College, where, among other things, he has just been promoted to Vice President of Academic Affairs, which I don't think he's totally happy about, because he obviously loves teaching probably more than the bureaucracy, right? And his specialty for teaching is the Bible and biblical history and so
Biblical
forth.
studies, yeah.
And he's just been included as Who's Who Among America's Teachers, and he recently published a second critical book review of the theology of Paul's letters to the Romans. So definitely an academic from our, can I say, sister college next to us, Northwest Christian College. So Tyler, why don't you call this thing in the air?
Oh, okay. Heads.
There you go. Do you want to be first and third or second and fourth? It's up to you.
It's up. Do you hear?
It's your call.
I'd rather not go first, personally.
Okay, well, that's fine. So you
It doesn't matter. I guess, was it second and fourth?
Second and fourth.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So that means Chuck, Mr. Hunt, we're going to start with you. So again, keep an eye on Kevin. He's the timekeeper, and
Okay, how long do we have?
10 minutes. 10 minutes.
10 minutes.
And
Where's
he'll give
Kevin?
you a warning when you got 1 minute.
Okay, you're right.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, let's have at it. Chuck, what do you say?
Okay, I have a few comments I want to make. First of all, I think that what we can all agree on is the importance of a challenging education that makes students thoughtful, critical, and prepares them for a productive life in the larger society. I think that's one thing we can agree on. I'm not sure that we can agree on the second proposition I put forward, and that is that all of us are biased. And I find people have a real hard time with this. And Doug, you were saying, well, professors would be upset if they're accused of bias. I usually begin my classes by talking about the fact that I'm biased. And I think that's only responsible. I'm not unaware of the fact that I'm biased. And in fact, what you find in a classroom is that you only have so much time. There's only so much you can present. I don't want to present the things I think are stupid and unimportant. And so the choice is a question of values and has to be based on a bias. And so I would never claim not to be biased. But just to make clear my bias, I think the question here is skewed, because from where I sit, professors look way too conservative. And I think they are. And that probably tells you that my seating at the table is correct. I consider myself fairly far left, and I think I'm fairly obvious about that, and I try to make that clear to my classes. Now, a couple of things. I want to talk a little bit about this whole liberal conservative thing. And then I think we really need to get past this whole question, because I think it's really a false question. And I think it hides a larger agenda, which is really much more important to address. Let's first of all talk about liberals and conservatives. It's a sophomoric distinction. Anyone who thinks that professors or the public at large can be dissolved into these two groups is working under a fascinating illusion, but let me assure you it's an illusion. First of all, professors and people in a larger society are not consistent like that. Their views don't all fall together that way. What's more, liberal and conservative are only two categories. There are also reactionaries and radicals. So there's at least four categories, none of which are always internally consistent. I consider myself a left radical. What does that mean? That means to solve the problems of this society, I think you have to take it apart and start over again. Liberals think you can fix it with small tweaks and changes. Conservatives think you ought to keep it the way it is. And reactionaries think you ought to return it to the McKinley era or sometime earlier, which I think is what's happening in the White House and parts of Washington. So there's at least four different groups. And the idea that somehow you can pigeonhole someone in one of these, let me address the accusation that Doug made that I'm a liberal. As I said to you, it doesn't fit my view of the larger society and what needs to be done. But let's just take two issues. Let's take gun control. I'm not in favor of gun control. Never have been. I spent my life as a young person. I didn't just fish, Doug. I hunted. And I make firearms. My father made firearms. And I'm not in favor of gun control, which is a unique position for a Quaker, which I am also. But I see gun control as not solving the fundamental question of violence in the society. Also, I'm unique among Quakers, I think, in not being entirely opposed to the death penalty. I'm opposed to the way in which it's now applied. I think that it is disgraceful the way we apply it, and it should be reserved for mass killers. And I'm not sure we should apply it to mass killers, but I think it should be a possibility. I think people like Adolf Hitler, I think Henry Kissinger, I think George W. Bush should be capable of being tried in an international court and have the possibility of execution available for their mass murders. I'm not sure when mass occurs, but I certainly think when you get over 50 to 100,000 people that have died because you've lied, because you've committed an aggressive war, you ought to be open to the possibility when you're tried of being executed. I'm not sure I would advocate it at that time, but I think it's a possibility. Well, these are not left-wing liberal positions. And so people are not consistent, and I certainly am not consistent. And I think your dichotomy assumes that people are and that there is such a dichotomy. I don't think there is. What's more, a person's position on a left-right dichotomy changes over time. In fact, the very dichotomy comes from the French Revolution, and it comes from the fact that at the beginning of the Revolution, conservatives were sitting on the right, radicals on the left. As the revolution changed, they moved. The conservatives actually lost their seats. The radicals moved to the left, and more radicals came in. So it totally changed over time. So how can you assign this sort of, it's an absurd dichotomy. Another thing I'd like to mention is that the concern about the liberal departments, it's usually this liberal assignment is done by department. It often targets sociology, targets a few other. Well, it's interesting that the concern is never expressed about other departments. What about the business department? How come we haven't got half the business department committed to labor research? How come we haven't got half the economics department dedicated to Marx? How come we haven't got, I'll take half of the Pentagon full of Quakers? But nobody wants to talk about that kind of equality. We just want to talk about one or two departments that are supposedly liberal that need to be unbiased, that need to be moved in another direction. Well, the other thing that I've been kind of amused about is reading about how professors who are too liberal or too left would injure their students or treat them badly or somehow be biased in the grading. This is a kind of an interesting thing because I'm sad to tell you, and I'm not proud of it. I don't know the names of my students. In 204, there are 520 of them. I've never really tried. I couldn't identify who's left or who's right. And what's more, if I did, I couldn't figure out what their name is and apply it to their grade. And even on top of that, I don't do the grading. I supervise the grading, and the GTFs do it. And I supervise from a distance. I make sure that it's done properly, and I approve it, but I don't even do the grading. So I find this whole sort of accusation kind of strange to use it's using a bizarre Sophomorean categorization. And I think what's important about it is that it has a larger agenda. That the purpose of this, I mean, its application is so silly when you look at it closely. Its purpose is much larger. Its purpose is to discredit critical thought by professors at the university, particularly if it's progressive critical thought. And there's a reason for this. Has a long history. William Buckley did it in the 1950s. George Bush I did it in the late 80s, 1990s by doing the politically correct trying to accuse people of being politically correct. Its purpose is to discredit progressive critical thought that occurs on campus. This is rather amazing when you think that the Republican attack radio dominates radio, with the exception of NPR, that the corporations own and dominate the news media and the television media, that this whole conservative and Republican and reactionary wings dominate much of the conversation in the society. Why is it important then to shut up a couple of departments at the university? Because if the emperor has no clothes, it's extremely dangerous. It's important that no one be able to speak about it. No one. And so you must shut up even the smallest dissenting voices. That's the purpose of this attack on professors. And I think I'm about finished. My time is up. I'll turn it over to the next speaker.
Great, thank you. And you know, I should know better than to call you a liberal. Some of you might, if you've been around here long enough, you might remember Kevin Hornbuckle. Anybody out here remember Kevin Hornbuckle? Well, he was actually a Eugene City Councilor who was proud of the fact that he was a member of the Communist Party. And he hated being called a liberal. To him, liberals are just passive cop-outs who talk and never accomplish anything. So yes, Chuck, it's important to make the distinction between radical leftists and liberals. They're certainly as different as liberals and conservatives. Now, I don't know where you identify yourself, Tyler, but in any case, our next speaker is Tyler Graff.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'm going to be speaking pretty much extemporaneously, and I'm not a professor like Professor Hunt, so hopefully my thoughts will be lucid and cogent, and everybody will be able to understand what I'm saying, more or less. First of all, I'll start off by stating that I came to the university. One of the reasons why I chose the University of Oregon over other universities was because in high school I guess I identified myself as a liberal, and I definitely wanted to come to a place that had what I perceived to be liberal ideals and liberal notions. When I came here, I think that it was a shock to see that, as Professor Hunt said, there wasn't as much like liberal idealism here as much as the sort of echo chamber of leftist rhetoric. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think that in many ways, having people who are critical of a government or critical of like the dominant paradigm, I guess, so to speak, is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, we do have, most of our branches of government, or all of our branches of government, are controlled by conservatives. So to have this liberal voice out there in the open is definitely a good thing. But what I saw when I came to the University of Oregon was essentially an echo chamber, where it wasn't so much people coming up with ideas as much as people sort of reasserting themselves as political activists or trying to get their name out there as political activists. It became more of this ego-driven thing more than anything involving research or trying to change anybody's idea, because all of the ideas were essentially the same. And so slowly my idea of the university campus as a whole sort of changed, and I saw myself becoming progressively more conservative, although I don't consider myself to be completely conservative. I consider myself to be a libertarian or a liberal, I guess. I believe in free markets. I believe in freedom and individualism. I guess saying I believe in freedom is kind of ridiculous. Most people do. But I believe in individuals over this broad or broadly defined notion of society. And so that was one thing that I noticed slowly by being on campus, that there was just this echo chamber, and I thought that did a disservice to the university as a whole and to all universities as a whole, because it stifles a certain segment of thought on campus, certain people feel uncomfortable voicing things in class when there are professors up there making jokes about how conservatives or Republicans are stupid. And I think that's legitimate to a certain extent. I think that it is difficult to have differing opinions or feel comfortable expressing these opinions in a classroom when the person who's in charge of the class, him or herself, is making disparaging comments. And like I said, I'm not a member of the Republican Party or anything like that. And for me, I'm capable of rolling my eyes and being like, okay, whatever. It's this is more the professor patronizing the students more than anything else. But I slowly began to understand why there was a lot of resentment among more conservative students on campus. And I think you can see that if you look at the college Republicans compared to the college Democrats. The college Democrats is actually, it doesn't have as high of a membership as the college Republicans on campus. And I think you have to ask yourself why. And I think that's because it's easier for the college, or for people who consider themselves students, or who consider themselves to be conservatives, to feel or try to go out and join like-minded people, because the campus as a whole, you come here and you think everybody is liberal, everybody has these leftist ideals. And a lot of that is propagated by professors on campus. And I think that sort of does a disservice to this idea of the Socratic method of questioning things and bringing up different points of view and not being shouted down, because that definitely does happen in class. I'm not saying that it's necessarily a professor's fault that happens, but there are certainly times when it's not needed in class. For example, after the election last year, I had a class entitled The History of Publishing. It had nothing to do with politics, but it was after the election day. And it was a class of about 20 people, and there were 2 professors in the class. And it was a 3-hour class. And for the entire class, we discussed the election, and there was a lot of crying, and there was a lot of yelling about how Bush was going to destroy America. Okay, whatever. But as it went on and as it went on, I noticed that the professors were more facilitating this discussion than and voicing their own points of view than sort of trying to create a legitimate discourse within the class. And as Professor Hunt said, I don't think there is really a problem with professors voicing their own points of view, especially if it's pertinent to the class. But in many cases, it's not. And in that particular case, I thought it definitely got in the way of the educational process. And, maybe there was, some reason why people felt like they had to, lay this all out on the table the day after election, and this was their venue for doing it. However, I didn't really see the educational need in doing that. As for attacking professors who are deemed to be too liberal, I know I've done it in the past, and I know that I've questioned professors about why most professors are liberal. And like I talked to Jane Kramer about this, who's a professor of political science, and she basically stated the same thing that's stated in the John Tierney op-ed piece, and that most professors believe in the public good, whereas, and that's something that's shared among liberals, whereas conservatives want to enter the business world. So I think that, as a conservative voicing these complaints, saying, professors are too liberal and professors believe this or professors believe that, I don't think it's invalid at all, because I think most professors who realize that they are liberal will basically agree with that. And So yeah, in conclusion, I definitely think that professors are liberal, and I believe that does a certain amount of disservice, but there's nothing that can really be done about that particular thing unless you wanted to change, tenure requirements or hiring practices, and those should definitely be left up to departments. And certain departments attract more liberal people than other departments. If you take an econ class, of course you're going to hear that free markets are fantastic and that we shouldn't have a minimum wage or anything like that, and liberals in the class will be aghast. And if you take a sociology class, you're going to hear the other side of the debate. Having said that, I think it still cuts across different lines between the humanities and also the sciences to an extent, and in the end I think it does a disservice to the university as a whole, because both sides of the argument don't have equal say, and that's not to say that students are going to be graded badly for voicing a conservative opinion. It's just that maybe certain conservatives won't feel comfortable stating their actual beliefs in class, and I think that is the sad part of this.
Good timing. You finished up right in the button. Thank you very much, Tyler, and I will be looking forward to reading more articles from you in the commentator. Okay, so our next speaker, especially because you're the only student on the panel who actually sits and listens to professors.
That's true.
Yeah, the rest of us just profess. And now, David Frank, it's all yours, sir.
I rejoice at this opportunity to join with you, especially you undergraduates who are pursuing a liberal arts education. And I stop at this moment to thank Sharon Schumann, who initiated the Community Conversations series, which is designed to expose students and others, community members, to different points of view. It is a series that Sharon conceived that rooted in the assumption that we should all be contrarians, that if I say you should vote for George Bush, you should think as a human being about reasons why you might not vote for George Bush. A good liberal arts education should give you the equipment that you need to live in a participatory democracy. You should be able to take more than one point of view on an issue. And you should do so in search of multiple truths. You should do so with a sense of humility, that you do not, as Chuck pointed out, have an immaculate perception, that everyone has a bias. So the matter then becomes, which bias will you choose? Which values will you embrace to make the policy choices that ought to be made? And so I begin by, first of all, declaring that I am a liberal. I can also tell you that having taught at the university for 24 years, I have not received a single student complaint in my office about exhibiting my bias in terms of judging papers or treating students in a way that was not fair. I'd like to say as well, number two, that according to the research, 75% of the people in the military declare themselves as conservative. Is our military too conservative? Should we be concerned about that? Should that be the topic of our next community conversation, discussion, and debate? A third point I'd like for you to keep in mind, and that is that 95% of all the CEOs in this country are white and male, and most of them are Republicans, 95%. So do the captains of industry exhibit a bias? Do they embrace a certain ideology that should concern us, one that ought to be the topic of a debate in some future community conversations? I'll leave that up to you. Chuck identified 3 objectives that he believes we ought to seek as a university. That is, first of all, that we should try to promote thoughtful conversations, thoughtful graduates, students who are critical, and also the students that live productive lives. I would add a 4th objective, and that is I would hope that we would prepare students to be contrarians. And that is, I'm hopeful that we would prepare students to disagree with one another, but to do so with reason, with proof, and with evidence. So, for example, I disagree with Chuck on gun control. I think we should have gun control in this country. The evidence that I have reviewed in the social scientific literature suggests that gun control decreases murder, decreases crime. We certainly can debate that issue, but I disagree with him. And I think that illustrates to you that when an attempt is made to group all professors together under the label liberal or left, that there are often cracks and divisions that betray that label, suggesting that we are individuals. Sometimes we agree, sometimes we don't agree. We sit to the left up here, but that is simply a matter of convenience, because on many other issues, I imagine we disagree. But we do agree, I think Dennis agrees with us, and Tyler as well, that we want students to be thoughtful, we want students to be critical, we want students to live a productive life, and I'm also assuming that we want students to be contrarians. And so with that in mind, I'd like to just briefly talk about what it means to be a liberal, because if I am assessing my audience correctly, I may be the only liberal creature in this room. The notion of liberal can be traced back to the Middle Ages, and it comes from the Latin word libertas, which means freedom and liberty. Now, liberal arts education was designed by the ancient rhetoricians to give students the freedom of thought, that they would not bow to any one particular authority other than reason. And that is what a liberal arts education ought to provide students, the ability to use one's brain, one's reason, to solve the problems of the world. Not bow to a king, not bow to one person's interpretation of the Bible, not bow to a person's violence or authority, but to use one's mind in a thoughtful way, in a critical way, in a productive way, in a way that incorporates a contrarian impulse. We need contrarians in the society, those who will, when they hear an assertion, question it. And the questions then sometimes become more important than the answers. An important study was conducted about 10 years ago, and the study was designed to determine what distinguished those who rescued Jews from the Nazis from those who did not. And the study revealed that there was only one characteristic. It wasn't education, it wasn't income, it was family upbringing. And that those who rescued Jews came from families in which they were encouraged to question, to reason, and to argue. Those who did not rescue Jews tended to come from families in which corporal punishment was used to enforce discipline, and which an authoritarian father or mother was in control. That was the distinguishing factor, separating those who rescued Jews from those who did not. I think that's an important conclusion for us all to keep in mind, because there is a moral impulse at the foundation of a liberal arts education, and that is, it provides people with the mental and psychological and spiritual resources to resist tyranny and totalitarianism. I rejoice when I have conservative students in my class, because they will challenge me. And I rejoice when they are able to challenge me to the point that they can show where I am wrong. Because if they can show me that I am wrong, I have made an improvement in my life. And so what Tyler talked about, and I listened to him carefully, in his history of publishing class, and when he said that there are students who are conservative that do not feel comfortable expressing their opinions, that's not a liberal teaching, Tyler. That's a bad teacher. There are conservatives who are bad teachers. There are conservatives who do not tolerate contrary opinions. There are conservatives who foster conversations that do not allow a full range of opinions. That's bad teaching. That's not liberalism. And I condemn it. And I am sorry, and I apologize on behalf of liberals to you, Tyler, that you were not well taught in that particular class. So I end by disagreeing with my good friend Chuck Hunt and calling upon Michael Harrington, who was a great social prophet. He wrote a wonderful book in the early 60s on the other America, the America that lacks the resources to even be here. And he pointed out one time that Americans are conservative in their values, But if you look at particular issues, they are often liberal. And I would include among those issues gun control. The majority of Americans are in favor of gun control. The majority of Americans are in favor of abolishing the death penalty. The majority of Americans are in favor of raising the minimum wage. The majority of Americans are in favor of many of the issues that liberals and Democrats claim to be their own. But what liberals have failed to do is to deal with matters of faith and matters of patriotism, matters of love of country. And that is why many people who should vote Democrat, should be liberal, fail to do so. They are offended, as Tyler is, by the fact that liberals mistreat conservatives and call them stupid. And that's not liberalism. That's bad human behavior that should be condemned irrespective of ideology. So I think we agree on more than we disagree. I think we agree that an education should produce thoughtful students, critical thinkers, a productive life, contrarians. I think Chuck, would agree with me that you were mistreated in some of your classes, that you were not listened to. That legitimate discourse should be an objective, that if you are in my class and you express your opinion, it may be possible that I am wrong and you are right, and that I should embrace the humility necessary to understand that my beliefs are based on tentative evidence that should yield to better evidence. If you have better evidence and better proof than I can marshal, then you should win the day. But that day is not over. The conversation continues, and that is what is so wonderful about the University of Oregon. It's 130 years old. It's the oldest institution in the state of Oregon. And it's the oldest institution because it is dedicated to a liberal arts education, free expression, reason, and a deep respect for matters of faith. I'm done.
Well, seriously, I'm sure all of you have noticed that really what Tyler and David had to say was not very different as far as what your values are. It's just that somehow you see the situation within the classroom being somewhat different than maybe you would normally see it in the classroom, right? And of course, the other thing, David, that you pointed out is that what we have done a very poor job of, especially on most universities, is dealing with the controversies involving religious faith. And that's why we're extremely fortunate that we have Dr. Dennis Lindsay, the Dean of Arts, from Northwest Christian College. Sir, it's your chance.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to be here and to participate in this discussion as well. I think perhaps I should begin by setting the record straight here a little bit. I'm not sure I'm sitting in the right chair on the right side, and I'm not sure I'm the best team player. I may be the weak link over on this side, but I want to put that aside because I think that perhaps assumptions lead perhaps also to the misconception that we have with this whole question of liberal and conservative. And I agree with Chuck. I think that the question is skewed. This is one of the things that I was mulling over as I was thinking about this. I think that the question put, are professors too liberal? This is assuming that professors are, generically speaking, liberal. And while that may be the case in many areas, it may not always be the case. But I would, at any rate, if I were going to rephrase the question, my rephrasing would be: are professors liberal enough? And I think that's what I would like to follow up on. Liberal versus conservative, my colleagues, we've talked about this. These are very relative, very subjective terms. I don't find them extremely useful, and I have. See, I don't like to talk a lot, so people are always making assumptions from me. I come from the Midwest, from the Bible Belt, and so anyone who has gone through theology in the Midwest and coming from the Bible Belt, you go back to the Midwest and people make assumptions about you, and so you just you have to live with those sorts of things and go on. For many people who knew me when I was growing up, they would think that I am extremely liberal. Others whom I meet might think that I'm very conservative. At the end of the day, these aren't extremely useful terms. And I don't like to, well, if I use one, I know which one I don't want to use. But the labels, I think, often are pointing in the direction of extremes. It is valid to talk about extreme liberalism as a kind of closed, dogmatic, unreasoning fundamentalism. You can talk about fundamentalism in the same way that extreme conservatism is commonly referred to as fundamentalism. And the dynamics are much the same, I think, in both of those instances if you're looking at extremes. And in this sense, it is indeed possible for university professors to be too liberal in the same way that we might say that some are too conservative if you get a fundamentalism in there that is unswerving. But my understanding of liberal, I think, is a more positive understanding in the way that it relates to the field of higher education. And David, you're not the only liberal preacher around here, so I think that the points that I would highlight are the same kind of points that you've already brought up. In the context of the liberal arts, there's a special focus here on a multiplicity of ideas, and in fact, the university, the concept of university grew out of the European context, where there was a center and a number of diverse issues growing around that center. Now, I'm happy to talk about the queen of the sciences as theology in that original university setting, and that was more or less the center. But that center gave rise to great diversity simply because it allowed people to think, it allowed people to explore the humanities, it allowed people to explore the sciences in new ways that were not explored beforehand. And so that the modern university would not be here if it were not for the liberal arts, the freedom to think, the freedom to question, the freedom to be contrarian, and to look at different sides of an issue. And so I think that is a positive thing, and we have to see that as a positive thing. And I would agree with Chuck again when he says that education needs to be a challenging education, leading us to critical thinking and to productive lives and the whole thought process. You can't just shut off the brain in order to pursue one particular pathway. So liberal denotes then, for me, the tendency to liberation. In theology, you can talk about liberation theology in the context of Latin American theology. Has had a very, very important, very positive impact upon the world of theology and the world of faith. And those of us who are living in this so-called post-Christian West are just beginning to glean some of the real benefits that have come from a liberation approach to theology. Liberal denotes a tendency to liberation. So a liberal professor, I think, is one who is personally liberated through education. The Latin root of education, of course, means simply to bring out or to lead out. It's getting out of where you are. You may have your own cultural context. You may have your own bias, but education insists that you come out, that you lead yourself out. A liberal professor then is also one who is able to liberate others through the educational process, to lead others out. And you can't force them out. It's a leading out, a leading in terms of one's own personal educational process, how one has developed personally, and then able to model that for students in the classroom. Cannot force people out, but you can lead students out. And I think that this may be one of the issues that Tyler has addressed as well, in terms of It's not really helpful to try and force people either through discrimination or through being the brunt of political jokes or things like that, to try and force them in some other way. Bumper stickers don't really convert anybody, and you know, those sorts of things are simply designed to try and force people into a pattern. That's not the way education works. Education, at its best, has to do with a nurturing, critical atmosphere where people can explore their ideas, explore thoughts in an environment that allows them to do that safely and come to some new insights. So to add the faith element, perhaps that David nuanced, I would do it in one word. Liberal has really less, in my mind, it has less to do with certain political, religious, moral, ethical, economic stances, although, you know, those are the classic descriptions of liberal conservative. It has, for me, less to do with that and more to do with a basic disposition of respectful tolerance that encourages inquiry, that encourages exploration in the whole range of academic inquiry, and allows people to be who they are as they are journeying on that way to become who they are going to be. In theological terms, I would call it grace. It's a matter of graceful tolerance to encourage people to think, even to think what they've been thinking, but allow them to think that in a context where they hear new ideas, where they experience new ideas, both from fellow classmates and from their professors, and an environment that nurtures that process of inquiry and helps them to learn and grow and be led further down the line.
Let's applaud all four of the panel members. We get to applaud too. All right? We get to applaud too. So now we have about a half an hour left, and we want to open up for questions. I just want to make the comment that unless I'm not hearing right, which I think I am, basically all four of our panelists are saying the same thing, aren't they? That a university education should be an open-minded place where professors don't try to indoctrinate anybody, but in fact respects the differences of opinions of their students. And I think all four of you agreed on that. The difference is that I guess, Tyler, you see that that's not happening on the campus simply because of the fact that too many leftist or liberal professors, rather than being respectful and encourage challenging, they're sort of repeating the same old liberal ideology of the 60s or something. Is that kind of what you're
Well, I mean, yeah, I see a lot of that. But I apologize for going second because I most likely sounded like a whiner. And it upsets me too when like the college Republicans, who I disagree with on a lot of issues, come up to me and whine about how professors, you know, said something in class, and it's like, get over it. It's not really ruining your educational process, is it, because a professor said something? If it really bothers you that much and you don't feel like you can speak in class, and that's an issue that you need to take up with somebody else. And it's true that is an issue. It's not an issue of, you know, ideology or anything. It's an issue of teaching. But yeah, so hopefully I wasn't whining too much.
Okay, with that in mind, we've got about half an hour for questions. Do you have your hand up?
Always.
Go ahead. You have a question, comment?
I thought it was very interesting that libertarians shared a group with liberal. That was interesting. And while you all were speaking about the differences between conservative and liberal, I began to think of the current college experience, and I think liberal arts degree brought that very much into contact with what we do here. And I began to think of musical conservatory as the only conservative view of education that I could find, where they are truly conserving these past methodologies and these past works of art and attempting to recreate them. And I think we do that here as well, much in sciences and even in rhetoric and even in sociology. So much is passed on from masters to students. I guess that's my comment. Good question on that.
Did you have any questions then for any of the panelists based on that?
I actually have a question about the letters of Paul.
Why don't you go ahead and ask the question? We got an expert here for a rare moment.
Yeah, no kidding. Briefly, I know we have so many people here that would love to ask questions. Paul's views on marriage as represented by his letters.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're going to you'll have to ask the question then whether I'm a liberal theologian or not. It would depend, I think, on which letters you're talking about, because you may be aware that not all letters that are Pauline are actually agreed by scholars to have been written by the Apostle Paul. Okay, so I think that's an important point to be made there. The other point, I'm not sure exactly which passages about marriage you might be referring to. Did you have something specific in mind?
It's actually my girlfriend who's studying the letters of Paul, so
Okay.
I apologize for not being versed as well as I could. I was told that Paul viewed marriage as a bit of a last resort for those who could not control their desire.
Oh yes, well that does actually come up in Pauline literature, and probably has to do with more his immediate eschatology. Paul, in some of his letters, has a very strong sense that we're living in the very last days. Okay, and so some of the things that he has to say, particularly in his letter to the Corinthians, is construed in that way, and scholars will say, well, you know, he's saying this because, and the idea it's better to stay celibate because of the hard times and that sort of thing, and that may be where the questions are arising there. But what I would say about that, and you can say it about other issues with Paul's letters, these letters are what we call occasional letters. They are written in specific circumstances in specific occasions to congregations in the Mediterranean world. To take everything from those occasions and just simply transfer that over to a different time, a different place, different occasion may be doing injustice to that. Does that help you?
Yeah, it sounds very liberal.
Okay.
Now, Chuck, you wanted to make a comment earlier about his earlier comment?
Just a couple of comments. I want to be critical of students because you've been critical of professors. I've got a problem this quarter. I'm teaching a 94-person class in race, class, and ethnicity. And I cannot get anyone to take a conservative point of view in that class, and I'm going absolutely nuts. And after the class, I'm asking my GTF, is this because of me? Do they think they have to do this because of me? Why can't, and I'm struggling. We're talking about racism today, and by some definitions, only white people can be racist. I presented that, and I'm waiting for the whites in the class to get, it's a very mixed class, it's a wonderful class. I'm waiting for the whites to get, you know, a little bit of heat. We got nothing. No heat at all. Everybody agreed with the definition. I'm going nuts. And I am very disturbed by the inability. It's a wonderful class, don't get me wrong. And if anybody's watching in that class, I love it. but the fact of the matter is I'm having trouble getting them to really get in there and bite into that stuff and disagree and debate it. And they need to. And I know it's going on out there, but I can't get them to do it in the class yet. They're not comfortable enough with each other. I'm trying to make them comfortable with me. I've put on the syllabus that any opinions are welcome as long as they're not intentionally designed to hurt people, that it's important that we get a debate going, and even if we hurt each other accidentally, we're going to be able to deal with that as a class and learn together. It's this, you know what's going to happen? And it's going to really damage my self-image, or at least my image around campus. I guess I'm going to have to start arguing the conservative point of view in this class. And it terrifies me because I don't want to do that. And my golly, somebody will have to write into the commentator and the Emerald and say, it's terrible. There is a problem on discussion in class.
But this is a class about race and issues concerning race. But yeah, I mean, that's such a thorny topic on any campus to begin with. A lot of people might be afraid of voicing some kind of contrarian opinion, contrarian to your own opinion, in the class since you're the professor. And not to say that people in that class, might not have that point of view, but it might be a little, I can see myself being kind of issues concerning race are very
But touchy. Something? I'm scared to death too.
Yeah, well...
I'm a white male and they're talking about race.
Of course, and professors have gotten in trouble for doing that in the past, so yeah, I can completely understand that.
Let me make, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to say it is kind of surprising that somebody hasn't spoken up. But,
well, and they're expressing wonderful opinions a lot, but I don't feel like there's a whole range of opinions that aren't coming out yet, and that's I'm going to keep working on that. Let me just say one other thing, and I'll be quiet. I really will, I promise. I think that we sense a lot of agreement, and Doug, I think you're bringing that out. What I'm not sensing, though, is an answer to my final statements, which are that while we can agree, I think David Horowitz's websites, I think what's being debated in the media in a larger sense is clearly intended to intimidate professors, to limit their willingness to put out challenging ideas, and ultimately to shut down in a few departments what little left debate is going on in the society. And that's a much more macro view. And I'm not sure that any of the five of us are involved in that. I don't want to present that as some kind of conspiracy or something like that. I'm not sure any of the five of us are involved in that, but I'm really concerned about that in the largest sense. And
but Chuck, if that was true, then the students that you discussed would in part be marching to the drumbeat of David Horowitz, and when they got to their computer in the morning, they would turn it on and go right to his website to read what they should think for the day. And they would turn on Fox News and then get the conservative talking points that they could use to refute your analysis of race relations. So I agree with you that the news media in this country is conservative, and that many of the messages that our students receive and other people receive tend to celebrate market capitalism. At the same time, at the local level, in Gilbert Hall 330, wherever you teach, you have a representative sample of American students who have, for whatever reason, resisted that ideological temptation, and they seem to agree more with you than they do with Fox News.
I'm afraid some of them follow me from class to class.
That very well, but my experience has been the same as well. I'm teaching a course on civil rights, and every student, every white student, says that he or she believes that the playing field in America is not level, that racism is systemic in America. They believe in affirmative action. They believe what I believe as well. I try to present the contrarian point of view and try to introduce them to conservative thoughts. So I just don't, at least on this campus, see Fox News making great inroads. I think if any group on campus feels marginalized, it's the college Republicans and those who write the comments. Well, okay, the commentator.
And I'll just add, from time to time I've done surveys among my students. And basically I would say I find about what you're talking about. For example, if I ask about abortion, basically 100% of the class virtually is pro-choice. Yeah. Any question, pretty much 100% of my students on an anonymous questionnaire are in favor of gay and lesbian rights to marry and so forth. And so yes, I end up sometimes taking a conservative position on these issues for the same argument that you use in order to somehow create some sort of contrarian position to get them to think that, gee, maybe there is another point of view. Okay, let's start. We got some good questions coming. You, and then you, and then you. Okay, so we got three questions. What's your question, sir?
My question is regarding labeling some of these point of views on any given situation, either liberal or conservative or reactionary or radical. The fact that when a professor presents these is, let's say there's a question out there and then they say this is a liberal point of view. I'm wondering if labeling that point of view as liberal or any other broad category immediately stifles the student's opinion and their ability to discuss. Now, if that label was not there, would it enhance their ability?
I think that's the point that Chuck was making. Those labels are often sophomoric, and they don't represent the complexity of the issues under discussion. So what is a liberal perspective or take on gun control? And you heard that Chuck and I disagree. What is the liberal take on the death penalty? You heard Chuck and I disagree. So I think your point is well taken, that we get caught up in these labels, words like liberal and conservative, and it stops the thinking process. And so I think what you're trying to suggest is that we should either avoid using words like liberal and conservative, which is what Chuck is suggesting, or maybe seek a new language that is more robust, allowing for the expression of different points of view.
I believe in some ways that these categories are so sometimes broad or sometimes so narrowed down that students might feel like saying something out of the way is going against the professor, not even though they might not know their professor's true stance, is that they're feeling tied down by these labels. So maybe these labels are the fact, it's not the point of view that is stifling them, it's the labels themselves.
One of the things that will tie you down with those labels is thinking there's only two positions.
Right.
I mean, liberal and conservative, there just simply aren't. That's one of my problems with television or print media saying, well, we give both points of view. For Pete's sake, there's about 8 or 10 points of view on any topic. Subtle differences, sometimes major differences. And then you find somebody who goes right to a whole nother route and you realize there's a whole nother point of view. I think it's very stifling, the idea that there's a dichotomy.
I think it makes a difference too on what particular issue you're talking about. I mean, I find this true with students on what is admittedly a fairly conservative campus as far as the students are concerned. Many of their viewpoints are surprisingly liberal in my thinking as well. In terms of progressive thinking about race and ethnicity, and thinking about even issues revolving around sexuality, where you might consider a much more conservative thing there. I don't think that people always think in those terms, but there are some other hot button issues where the lines seem to be drawn a little bit more clearly. You know, support the troops or not. Is the war right? And it probably focuses around simply the political divide, Republican, Democrat, and most people don't even know what that means.
Yeah, really.
Yeah. Well, for me, since I write for the conservative journal of opinion on campus, I really do hate this sort of false dichotomy between conservatives and liberals, because I think most people, on staff who have written for the commentator are maybe fiscally conservative but socially liberal, and so, I mean, but are we still conservatives? Are we, or are we liberals? We are liberals on certain issues and conservatives on other issues, yet we're the conservative opinion journal on campus. And to go out there and be like, oh, I'm a conservative, people come in with this preconceived notion that, you're anti, or, you're pro-life, or, you're in favor of the war on drugs, that, you're anti-immigration, all of these things, which, personally I'm not in favor of any of those stances, and most of the people I know who, work for the magazine are not, do not share those beliefs either. And so, yeah, I definitely think that it can stifle opinions, or it can kind of foster these preconceived notions about what your views are, and these are false assumptions most of the time, I think, because you can't really pin people down into one category or another. There's a lot of gray area there.
Well, this is great. I think all of us on the panel now agree that this question was not very well phrased, and and this old liberal conservative dichotomy just doesn't work. We need new categories. But let's say you have the next question, and then you will have the next. So go ahead. What's your question?
Okay, so I guess I have to re-sound myself after that. Aside from politics, because it seems like a lot of this conversation has been centered around liberal or conservative stances politically speaking, I would say that much of the campus is liberal morally speaking, I guess. In one particular instance in a class, it was an ethics class actually, and a video, well not a video actually, but a slideshow of pornographic pictures was shown in class, as well as later on a movie on poultry farming. And in the 300-some person class, 2 people, including myself, left during the pornographic show, and over half of the class left during the poultry farming. Mm-hmm. And I guess my comment is just whether, excuse me, I get jerked, whether or not it seems like a very liberal stance on moral relativism almost is being promoted in a lot of the classes. And the more conservative positions on those kinds of things seem to automatically be labeled as hate promoters, or I don't know. I guess I'm just putting that out there.
First of all, this class sounds very interesting. And then, so you're basically talking about moral relativism, and okay. I think most conservatives would say moral relativism is a bad thing, but to me, I think moral absolutism can be equally as bad, and I think that it's only human nature to say that, to sort of create these distinctions or look at things, either historically or try to look at like the root cause of why certain things are a certain way, and that can be defined as moral relativism, when I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, and it can definitely increase discussion. But are you saying that people equated, like more people were offended by the poultry farming thing than the pornography itself, and so?
Right, I guess, and I feel like about 4/5 of that class identified themselves publicly as, they said liberal. I don't know if that would also include democratic. I don't know exactly, whether or not the labels were being applied correctly. Because, I obviously believe in a appropriate place for free thinking and criticism and everything, but it seemed like their priorities were being set in areas that were misled.
I think I don't know, like from my own personal experiences, if you say something is ridiculous on campus, or if you, I don't know, if you say something is ridiculous, you can have this label attached to, I guess.
Can I just ask for clarification? I can see why a number of people might walk out of the movie on pornography feeling offended. What was it about the movie on chicken farming?
Were they slaughtering the chickens, or?
If you know anything about
wait. I'm asking here, Chuck.
Okay,
so
what
was it about that movie that bothered half the people who would want to walk out? Was that was this favoring chicken farming, or what was the point of it?
It was actually, it was a film by PETA, so it was taken.
So then why would people walk out on it?
I think the gruesome nature of the video, and it was, which is a brutal kind of process, but,
I've seen that video. I about walked out myself. Yeah.
See, it would concern me a little bit more if you had been shown a video like featuring people being mutilated or something. We're just sitting there like, yeah, that's interesting. And then like the chickens came on, we were like, oh no, can't deal with that, and they left.
Well, I mean, it was in a 2-week span that both of these videos
Yeah.
were shown. And from what I didn't see the pictures myself, but from what I've talked to and several of the students in that class, the pictures were of extreme sadomasochism and slavery type things, and people didn't seem bothered by that. And the fact
Yeah.
is, just nervous.
Can I make a comment? I'm sort of shocked that they weren't. I am feeling a different question though from what you're saying, and that is something that I face all the time, and that is what's proper in the classroom and what's not. I'm feeling that question coming up. Let me just give you an example. I once showed Do the Right Thing by Spike Lee. I thought it was very important for a class in social problems to look at it. I'm going to show Crash this quarter in this class on class, race, and ethnicity. There are things in those films, particularly profanity, there may be nudity, there may be other things, which sometimes are difficult for me to know whether they should be presented to a classroom. Now maybe I'm a conservative here. I never have gotten to the point of ever even thinking about putting on a slideshow with pornographic material. But that's a real substantial problem. You have a problem of how much are you willing to offend students in the service of education? And how much is, yeah, really, I mean, that's what that
Hey, that'd make a
shows
good
about.
bumper sticker,
Yeah,
Chris.
PETA
How much are we willing to offend students?
But that's what
Yeah.
that PETA film is about,
Yeah.
so that when you go into the grocery store, you know what happened to that chicken you just bought.
And PETA is all about just offending people to make some sort of,
But
you know,
there is
creative
learning.
kind of
There is learning that happens there.
Well,
You have to
there is
deal with.
learning, yeah. You have to understand how chickens are farmed, I suppose, and then make a personal choice as to whether or not you want to eat something that
I just
created that way.
want
But
to say very quickly, when I'm watching PBS, I get offended that every time they have a serious program, it always starts off saying, some of you may be offended by this program, and as if we're all afraid to watch reality. And frankly, I think most TV is very offensive. And about the only TV that is not offensive are serious documentaries on PBS, which they say is going to upset some people. So
But see,
we all are upset
See,
by
when
different things.
when I do that in a class, though, I feel required to say they're gonna drop Fs. In this there's going to be nudity. There's going to be some things here, and I'm concerned about how you feel about it. Just one other comment, and it's kind of interesting. I consider myself an ethical absolutist. I don't consider myself an ethical relativist at all, and I think bringing that up is very important. And people always assume because they call me a liberal, which I don't think I am, and because I'm a 60s person, that I'm I often get classified as that I'm an ethical relativist, and it makes me really laugh. 38 years ago today, I was beaten unconscious and my hands were broken by the police at a demonstration at University of Wisconsin, which was on the TV last night. I didn't get beaten unconscious because I'm an ethical relativist. I'm an ethical absolutist. And I still consider myself that. I think we teach ethical relativism often, we appear to anyway, and I really have a problem with that. That's one of the reasons why I talk about bias in class and why I try to get in my students' face about being biased. I don't think both sides of the question are ethically the same. I think it's important to produce contrarians. I think it's important to see all sides of a question. But I don't want to give the impression that I think all sides are ethically equivalent, because they're not. And I am not an ethical relativist.
And I just want to back that up again too, Chuck. I agree with you because I'm always amazed that liberals are always accused of being cultural relativists. So it's very, very clear that most liberals have very deep-seated values that they take very seriously. And right now I'm looking at those conservatives in America who are such cultural relativists, they can shrug off the torture and the beatings carried out by our army at Abu Ghraib, and they keep reading conservative columns. Oh, it wasn't so bad. They didn't behead anybody, so and so forth. And I guess I'm a little bit of a cultural absolutist. I'm opposed to torture by anybody, and I don't see how any American can be such a cultural relativist as to say, oh, it's not so bad. They were just Arabs or something. Anyway, we got your questions next.
David may want to say something.
And then your question, and then your question. And did you want to add something to that, David?
I just want to acknowledge the pain that you experienced. I think that's the point that you're trying to raise.
Right.
And that you are working from an ethical point of view. One that I'm hopeful you will continue to use in your life, that you should not bow before a professor or yield to a professor on a point because you want a good grade. You know, you should be able to muster the ethical courage to speak truth to power. And you know, the power of a grade is in your life is insignificant. So if you're going to walk on eggshells in order to get a good grade in the university system, I fear what one might do when one goes outside of the university system. So the fact you walked out is an ethical act that your parents should be proud of because they raised you well. You walked out and you took action because you were offended for good reason. And it wasn't hypersensitivity, and you also noticed the hypocrisy in the student group, that they would walk out on chickens being murdered, but they wouldn't walk out when pornography, which I imagine it was a disgusting form of pornography. So I celebrate the action that you took, and I'm hopeful that you will continue to raise your voice when you face such instances, because there are, I guess this is where I would join Chuck in criticizing students. Y'all are passive.
Speak out.
My goodness.
Yes.
You come into class with your iPods in your ears, you pull them out, you pull out your Subway sandwich, you start eating, and then I speak. Sometimes I sneak in controversial or absurd statements, and students write it down. I am seeking students like Tyler who will say that he has a different point of view, and as long as he has some evidence as opposed to just a mere assertion,
I might agree with you on a lot of
it
issues.
could be too.
I don't know.
You know, but you're the kind of person that we want to produce at the University of Oregon. 2 out of 90 students who will have the courage to stand up and walk out if there's something, and then do something about it. Bring it to the attention of people to affect some change in social policy. So, amen.
Okay, great. Now, again, thanks very much, David, for bringing that up. That's really important. So we got your question, and then we'll have, your question and your question. So go ahead, sir.
Thank you, gentlemen, for the discussion tonight. It's really been interesting. A friend of mine on campus is striking, and the reason he's striking is a graduate student of peace studies is because of the weapons research that the university is engaging in, like many other universities and colleges across the country. Now, do you think it's morally acceptable? Here we have an environment where we're trying to teach our students learning, critical thinking, all these things, and morality. Do you think it's correct that the university should engage in this type of research involving weapons that are killing machines, mass destruction, whatever?
There's a great question.
Well,
I hope all three
I can address it real quickly. As I went to bed 38 years ago, I could not sleep on my back. I wouldn't be able to sleep on my back for 2 weeks because of the beating I received. That beating was a consequence of my trying to obstruct the University of Wisconsin's cooperation and complicity with Dow Chemical producing napalm. I absolutely am opposed to that kind of research, that kind of work on campus.
Are you helping him in his effort then?
We've talked, but I haven't, you know.
Because he needs some assistance.
Yeah. I'm hoping that goes somewhere. I've got a couple students working on it. I think it's a question that needs to be raised again on campus.
Yes.
Dean Lindsay, you have any thoughts about weapons? Is NCC involved with any weapons research?
Boy, I hope not. I would have great difficulty with that as well. Having lived in Europe, having seen over a period of years the difference that you have in terms of the whole area of gun control. Now, I know that this is a different issue on that, But I think that there needs to be a real critical view of that. The university, I can't stand over there on the corner and criticize here, because I know that this is a much different entity than what I'm involved in. But I chose a path that didn't involve me in that larger university, and I think that someone standing up for that is really very admirable.
David?
It's a complicated issue, and but he's talking about Brian Bogart, who I think is a courageous young man, and his critique is that the university is engaged in research that fuels the military machine in this country. We don't quite know how much money yet is devoted or to what research activities it is subsidizing. So his global claims to me are not thoroughly persuasive. He lumps the ROTC in the funding, and I think that the ROTC should. That's for those of you who don't know. Do you all know what the ROTC is? Okay. I think the ROTC is a good idea. I'm sure Chuck would disagree.
Yes.
Yes. So again, demonstrating that people of this side don't all agree, and so if that's part of the critique that he is issuing, which I think it is, then I would disagree with him on that. I do think that there is a necessity in this world for a standing military. I do think that there's a need for the police. I abhor, as I think we all do, the abuses that have taken place at Abu Ghraib. I also abhor the use of the money to fund Star Wars, but I haven't seen proof that the money being spent at the University of Oregon is fostering torture of Iraqis in Iraq. I haven't seen the research that Brian has not produced any research to suggest that the University of Oregon is funding research, or the NSF or the Defense Department is funding Star Wars. I've seen some low-level funding that really doesn't have a major consequence. But again, if he does, in spirit of...
From a moral standpoint, do you think it's all right for universities to engage in that type of research that involves...
That was your question. I'm deeply troubled by that. The complicity of the Defense Department. And again, I think that military officers should have the benefit of a liberal arts education.
Sure.
Mm-hmm. And then are we educating them to go off then to pursue war? Is that the link that we would want to draw between ROTC, university funding, and war? Is that immoral? Chuck probably, I don't know, speak for him, but I would say that he would argue that that's an immoral act on the university's part to fund ROTC. So there's shades of gray here, and at this point, Brian has not been able to display the kinds of nuances that I think we would need.
I'd just like to see him get more support.
Yeah.
Oh, so part of this question, I'm sorry, I was
Yeah,
gone.
right.
Too much,
So the question is
too much
basically,
tasty
how do you
water.
feel about Brian Bogart's opposition here being involved in military research?
Oh, okay. Well, it's not so much a strike for peace, because generally, I don't know, a strike involves withholding something from somebody else. An employee withholding work from an employer. He's withholding very little. Also, I've looked at some of his research. I mean, I've looked at some of the complaints that he's made about the brain-machine interface. And like for our magazine, we did a little interview with him where he explained his opposition to the brain-machine interface, which is a very scary sounding thing. And he described it as such. Basically, somebody will be able to control your actions through a remote control or remote-controlled device, because it would be like, your brain is hooked up to something. But when I looked into, the brain-machine interface, and of course research is being conducted into a brain-machine interface at other universities as well. It's not just the University of Oregon. It's more just from what I looked at, and maybe this is all like propaganda, Defense Department propaganda that they're telling journalists. But from what I read, its main function is to help quadriplegic individuals, and so there is a real-world benefit to this research that, you know, it's separate from the military, and also it's more I don't know. I don't know exactly what the research is. If I were to explain it, what I kind of read about it, it would probably sound a little crazy. But there are real-world applications to a lot of this research.
I'm just glad we have a student who isn't passive like you're talking about passivity for students, and it's nice to see someone out there
That's right.
making a statement.
Absolutely.
And I just wanted to applaud him for that.
Yes.
Okay, you got a question, long time ago. We finally got back to you.
Yeah, I actually had something I wanted to say when you brought up what you're subjected to watching. I'm not a conservative by any means, and I would have walked out with you. That's outrageous. I think it's horrible. And I would have walked out for two reasons, because one, I'm a feminist, and two, it's morally wrong to have to watch that in a classroom or anywhere. Yes, it is. And I guess the other thing I wanted to say is that one of the most conservative corporations I know of, the Disney Corporation, is the largest distributor of pornography in this country. And so it's, you know, it's something that I think crosses the line as well. I mean, they can't, a person can't be labeled that way.
Yeah.
So the question for the panel is, how do you feel about professors who decide that showing some porn clips is necessary to convey something about the academic issues that professor is trying to teach us? Are there any of you who would be supportive of this?
I'm not supportive. I mean, I'm not anti-pornography by any means, but I think that technique is, I mean, it's primarily used for shock value, I would think, and so there's no real edification going on there, except just to shock people.
Just as a background, she said that because we were on a unit of freedom of speech, and she said that it was necessary to clearly identify what pornography is in the setting that we would be talking about it, so that we could intellectually talk about it accurately.
Well, were you showing pictures?
Assuming that college students didn't know what pornography was.
Well, I mean, pornography can be defined many different ways. Like when Robert Mapplethorpe was, you know, receiving NEA funding in the late '80s, people like Jesse Helms were very much against giving, you know, letting the NEA fund that sort of photography of like nude men in sexual poses. Because it was considered to be pornographic. So, I mean, how do you draw these lines? How do you delineate between what is obscene and what isn't obscene? I didn't actually see the pictures, so I can't make any judgment for myself. I think, it's good that people in your class made a personal distinction between what was obscene and what was, acceptable to them. And they made that by leaving.
Well, but here's another thing, is that afterwards, when I talked to several students about it, I guess just out of personal curiosity, many, both male and female, say that they wish that they had left at the beginning or midway through and felt they could not, I don't know, peer pressure or just whatever the reason, they felt they could not leave but wish that they had.
I think one of the things that concerns me about this is that I really feel like a classroom is a community effort, and that what you're describing is a fracturing of community. And my sense is that whoever was teaching that class should have had a sense. I'm sitting up here just shivering thinking of doing that in a classroom. It just makes me shiver to think of it. That should have been discussed with the class. It should have been an open topic of whether that's to occur, why it might occur. There should have been some agreements on that. That's why I put those things in my syllabus about this could be a class discussion that might hurt people by accident. We need to be able to work through that together as a community of learning. And that's what I'm really concerned about. It's hard for me to judge the pornography because I'm not seeing it. you start talking about, sadomasochism and all that kind of stuff, I'm sort of amazed that somebody would do that. But the real principle is the community of learning. That's what was fractured, and I'm disturbed by that.
Sharon, this is supposed to be over 9, was it? Kind of. Well, I know we have at least one more question. If anybody else has a burning question, we can follow up with it. But you've had a question for a long time. What do you want to ask?
About your question, I think, was, is that appropriate for him to be able to do that on campus?
No, I meant the moral issue here, our university, college.
You have a question the university being.
Okay, any more questions, any more comments while we've got this wonderful panel here together? Any other questions, comments? Okay, well then I'll just sort of try to summarize it. One of the things we have to realize is, as you all know, the United States is very split on political and social issues. We have the cliches about red states and blue states, as if every state is either ultra-left or ultra-right. And so this is a thing that affects every place in America, including our campus. It seems to me that, the most important point that's been raised is that you all agree that the classroom should be a place for open discussion. No student should ever be put down for asking critical questions. And so, of course, it bothers me, Tyler, that you feel that sometimes liberal professors or leftist professors will not show respect to a conservative comments or questions. And that's something that's got to change. And I think, because I've been teaching for 40 years, I remember the days when most colleges were pretty conservative back in the 50s, because that's when I was an undergrad. And any kind of a liberal or a leftist professor was suspect under the McCarthy era and so forth. Then through the 60s and 70s, clearly the pendulum swung way over, and certainly many of the undergraduates of the 60s, such as Chuck Hunt, have gone on and become professors, and so we have a strong feeling that's very different from what it was in the 50s and the early 60s. So that now it's not liberals, it's conservatives who often feel that their discussion or comments aren't taken seriously. And I think all of us who teach all need to make a really special effort to be sure that every point of view is respected in our class. I'll just mention one of the situations that I have is that one of the books of readings that I'm using in America's Peoples is a wonderful collection of articles and essays written by new immigrants to America. Now, as it happens, that one of the essays in there, articles, is written by a young woman who is a refugee from Cuba, and talks about how her life in America is so different than it was in Cuba. Actually, the title of the article is really funny. It's her parents saying that we brought you all the way from Cuba just so you can dress like that. It sort of gives you an idea. But it's a great article talking about what it's like to be an immigrant in the United States as a teenager from a country such as Cuba to come here. And for that reason, I have to use the article. She, the author is a lesbian and makes that clear, and makes it clear that she's had a number of lesbian love affairs, which I think doesn't bother me at all. I think on a university we should certainly feel free to discuss lesbian as well as heterosexual relationships. The problem is, in this particular article, this is a situation I have never run across in 4 years of teaching. In her article, she goes into rather graphic detail about the biology of her lesbian relationships. That doesn't bother me, and I'm sure it wouldn't bother the majority of the students in the class. But I am aware that, for example, for a more fundamentalistic Christian student, that would be appalling to have to read in detail a lesbian sexual encounter. So how do I deal with this? I don't want to throw out the article because I think it's a great article. So what I told my students was, if anybody had objections to reading it, then that's fine. I'll give them a different article to read that deals with some of the same issues. And as far as I know, maybe most people will read it, but I wouldn't want to force anybody to read an article which would be really morally offensive to them, even though I myself wouldn't agree with that. And so this is the kind of decisions professors have to make from time to time. On the one hand, our job is to enlighten students with things that they haven't heard about before, but on the other hand, it's not to shock people and upset people. So it's a fine line as we walk. So I think this has been a great panel. I wish 50 people had been here in the audience tonight. I'm glad that you came, Tyler, and you, Dean, especially, to keep us honest on this. And I hope that, this is going to be a beginning of where the left liberals and conservatives begin to have more dialogues. It's a different world than it was 30 or 40 years ago. So I hope we have a lot more discussions and dialogues this time. Thank you very much for attending. Great.
Can I borrow your pen, please? Of course. Neglected to fill this up.